Hello, BookTube. I'm Jonathan, and welcome to Words in Time. Today, I am joined by my good friend Baron from Your Brain on Books. Baron, are you ready to talk about the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Jonathan.
Baron, this is a crazy series. I'm going to say off the rip that I like this series, and throughout the video, I'll reveal exactly how much I like it, and we're gonna make some recommendations on who we might think this will appeal to. Baron and I decided to do a buddy read for the first book, The Three Body Problem, a little while ago, and life got busy. Life got busy for Baron. He had second thoughts about the buddy read, but I coaxed him into it. I reeled him into it, and we're lucky to have him on the channel today. So, The Three Body Problem is written by Cixin Liu, and if you don't know, the rough kind of setup is that we follow a couple of different timelines in China from the 60s Cultural Revolution to a kind of non-specified kind of modern day / near future. And weird things start happening to prominent scientists that might be linked to messages that are being sent into space by a mysterious mission of sorts. So off the rip, Baron, how much did you know about the book going into it? In terms of the style or the story, did you have any expectations for the book?
None whatsoever. I had some inklings that it was going to be related to some first contact material, but outside of that, I knew nothing going in.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a good way to go about it. I was kind of intentionally vague with my description there because I knew this was a popular book. I read the description maybe a year or so ago, and I thought, yep, that's definitely going on the TBR. And then I didn't read any more about it. I'd kind of forgotten what it was about by the time I read it. And I think that helps because in terms of the plot progression, I think that the blurb or the Goodreads description or whatever does kind of give quite a bit away. But luckily, I wouldn't say that the focus on this book is the story or the characters. It's kind of famous for having thin characters. It's the ideas. So Baron, I know you read a bit of sci-fi, but you like to read fantasy and some other genres. Are you familiar with hard sci-fi? When you hear the phrase hard sci-fi, do you think, yes, I'm in, or that's not something I normally read so much?
I definitely don't have the exposure to it that you do, but it is something that I enjoy, and especially after reading this series, I want to pursue more.
Yeah, this book is, I would say, if you saw my hard versus soft sci-fi video that I made recently, I'd say this is on the medium hard, even pushing hard side of sci-fi at times. But I don't want to dissuade you, put you off if you're not into hard sci-fi, because there's some really cool concepts here. So in The Three Body Problem, there's kind of a lot going on, but it has a central physics problem that I wasn't familiar with, the three body problem, which is essentially if we have two orbiting masses, the gravitational relationship, apparently it's quite easy to figure out how they're going to interact and what the orbit will be. But if you throw in a third one, for mathematical physical reasons, it becomes infinitely complex to try and calculate. Baron, were you familiar with the three body problem? Did it do any physics in high school or college?
No, I actually was familiar with the concept to some degree, how Newton's laws do break down once you have a multi-body system, but I didn't know how in any way that would relate to a narrative. So that was a big surprise going in, and I think it was well executed overall.
Awesome. Yeah, I was not familiar with it, but learning about it in the book, I found really, really interesting, and it didn't just feel like I was reading a textbook. It felt like it was something that was kind of weaved into the narrative, like in kind of an interesting and essential way. It's the way that Cixin Liu took physics and used that as kind of a jumping off point for a plot. I found to be really, really interesting. Were there any particular scientific concepts in the book that hooked you, or perhaps kind of went over your head? You're like, these passages are boring.
Not so much. I mean, there were so many ideas coming so quickly. So you didn't spend too much time with any particular ones, but I really like the exploration. There's some AI concepts in here. That's an area that definitely interests me. So I was happy to read about that. And I think the approach that was done in the book was different from what I've experienced in other sci-fi or any kind of related material, whether that be books or film.
Yeah, I think there's some really cool concepts here. There were a couple that kind of went over my head, but luckily nothing ever dragged on too long. If there was a couple of pages where I was like, my brain is getting scrambled right now, but I kind of like it. I'll catch up at some point, and if not, it's it was still just kind of fun reading through the insane concepts that Cixin Liu was coming up with. Now, in the first book in particular, the the backdrop of the Chinese Cultural Revolution plays quite a large part. Is that something you were familiar with? Had you read up on that period of history much?
Not really. You know, obviously my history knowledge is definitely Western focused overall. So that was another thing, an element to this story that I really appreciated, just having that exposure.
Yeah, I wasn't very familiar with it either, and I didn't feel like it relied on assumed knowledge. I felt like it kind of explained a few things. The book that does actually come with some. Let me see if I can find one. Just like flicking through. Here we go. Oh, this is good content right here. We have. There's a lot of. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but there is a lot of. What do you call them? Author's notes, translators' notes, and at first I didn't like it because I was like notes in novels kind of take me out of the story. But I because there is some hard science, because there are some specific history things that you might not know if you're not a science major or if you're a Western reader not familiar with some of Chinese history, I did think it helped. And throughout the series, we actually get less of those. I think. Did you feel like we got less in books 2 and 3?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It definitely shifted into the more fantastical than it was in the first book that was grounded very much in our world today.
Yeah, there's a little bit less hand holding that goes on in books 2 and 3, and the concepts are more forward looking than historically focused. Now, so this series is kind of famous for having thin characters not being the focus. I know character focused readers everywhere are clicking off the video right now. But hang on a second, Baron, did you feel like that's a fair kind of reputation on the book? What did you think of the characters in the series?
I definitely felt that way when I first started and through the majority of the first book. And I think my opinion changed later on. One, I realized I was searching for more of a Western style character that I'm used to. And I realized there's a lot more nuance to these. And also, as the books progress, you have a larger cast that's introduced. And I started to realize the primary protagonist of the story is more humanity than it is individuals. And once I started looking through it through that perspective, it really changed how I enjoyed the remainder of the series.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome way of putting it, that the focus is on humanity itself. I think this is a very unique series. I think the only author that I can sort of remotely think to compare Cixin Liu to is Arthur C. Clarke. So I'm a big fan of Arthur C. Clarke, classic sci-fi writer, and his stories tend to err on the medium to hard side of sci-fi as well, and lack of characters kind of is a criticism of a lot of his books. But to me, and I do enjoy well-developed characters, taking an emotional journey with them, but I think if the focus is on the story and the ideas, and there's just kind of enough character to service the goals of the author, that's not too off-putting for me. That's not something like, if I'm having my mind scrambled every 50 pages with some like crazy idea, that's not something that particularly bothers me. But I will agree that there was a little bit of character development, I think, particularly in books 2 and 3. We do kind of jump from character to character in location and time periods, etc. So it's not necessarily the longest of story arcs for each characters, but I did find them a little bit more interesting as we went on, kind of connected with them. Whether they were likable or not is a different question, but I did find them more intriguing.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Those are some of the key elements of the three-body problem. Was there anything that stood out to you that we wanted to talk about in the first book?
No, nothing in particular. Although I will say, you mentioned earlier, maybe who is this for? I would say one thing that is important with the first book is it deals with a lot of abstraction. So that is something I think you need to be comfortable with, and I think it's done very well. I don't think you're going to be a fish out of water if that's something you don't have any exposure to. But it is a very significant element in the first book, more so than I'd say in books 2 or 3.
Yeah, that's a very good note on the three-body problem. I think if you're hearing me talk about physics and science a lot, and you're like, that's not my main focus. I think also that the philosophy here is blended really well. There's a quote that I'm not going to try and get exactly correct because I've forgotten it, but it's something along the lines of should philosophy guide science, or should science guide philosophy? And I thought that the balance between the two was explored really, really well in the first book. So we're going to continue to be spoiler free throughout the whole video, but we'll talk a little bit about books 2 and 3 just to let you know, hey, we might have loved the first one, but then we hate books 2 and 3, so don't bother picking up the series, or just read the first one and stop, or we'll love them all. But before we get to books 2 and 3, I'm going to quickly give a score. For me, the 3 body problem, it was an 8.5 out of 10. I love the science, I love the concepts, I felt like I learned a lot about science and history, and it never lost my attention, but there were periods where I was like, okay, this is good, but what's the thing that takes it to that next level? So not quite a 5-star, but pretty darn close. We'll see if books 2 or 3 can get there. Baron, what are your final thoughts on the 3 body problem?
Well, originally I thought it was a 5-star novel until I read books 2 and 3, and then I had to reassess my score. So I think as of today, I would put it in that 4.5 range.
4.5 range. So we're pretty much on the same page there. So without getting into plot details or giving anything away, just broadly, what are some of the things that are different about the second book, The Dark Forest? Well, off the rip, the translate, I keep on saying that today. That's the phrase of the day, off the rip. That'll be in the thumbnail. This book was translated by Joel Martinson instead of Ken Liu. Did you notice a difference in the translation? Did you feel like there was a difference in style from book 1 to book 2?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think the pacing came across differently. Also, some of the character nuance wasn't quite the same. I didn't find it to be... I was pretty neutral about it overall, but I have seen some critiques about that areas with the translation. And as you go into book 3, which we'll get to in a minute, you can definitely see that kind of revert back to the kind of the prose style of book 1. So it is noticeable.
Yes, I agree. It felt a little bit different, although it was a little bit hard to discern whether that was just because of Cixin Liu getting another book under his belt. Is he developing as a writer, or whether that was down to the translation? Because some of the things that were a little bit different for me, the structure, the chapters are massive. There's like 3 chapters. They're like 200 pages long, which I hate. I'm going to let you know now. No chapter should ever be more than 20 pages long. Cut it short, divide it up somehow. I am, I guess, an OCD completionist. It annoys me to no end having to stop in the middle of a chapter. So I'll stay up until I'm super tired to finish that 40-page chapter if I need to, because I just can't go to sleep. Do you care about chapter length, Baron?
I'm with you. I prefer shorter chapters. One thing, I did do the Dark Forest on audio, and they do have it subdivided within each section of the chapter, so I was able to consume it fairly easily.
Yes, that rant was kind of more directed at books in general as opposed to The Dark Forest, because even if, let me see if I can find an example, even if there aren't technical chapter breaks, you will get these kind of like mini breaks where you're like, okay, I'll trick my brain into thinking that counts as finishing a chapter. Something that I noticed about book 2 was that it was quite funny. Did you think there was humor in book 2?
Yeah, you have introduction of levity, also some romance elements, some things that are not apparent in book 1 that at times make it feel a little more lighthearted.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was the translation or the characters, but there were some quite funny moments. I mean, there's pretty heavy moments too. There's some pretty dark and serious concepts in here, but just some of the dialogue and some of the ways that characters reacted to things in either a kind of absurd or just like very like straight man kind of responses to things just kind of tickled me. So I did enjoy that about book 2. I think for me, book 2 had a bit more of a linear structure of storytelling. Like book 1, you're like, there's some mystery, we're over here, not quite sure what to expect. Whereas The Dark Forest, I feel like it sets up expectations and then there's a twist or it delivers on them, and then it sets up expectations, and then there's a twist or it delivers on them. So I felt like this one read really quickly. How did you feel the Dark Forest read for you?
Oh yeah, it's definitely faster pace overall. It's just continuing compounded ideas that happen over and over and over again, and there's this kind of strung mystery throughout that really kept me going through it quickly. I mean, I felt that way about all three books. Honestly, I read them quite quickly. Within 2-3 days each one.
Yes, yes. I think we started around the same time, and Baron definitely beat me to finishing book 3. So I had an inkling that he was enjoying it because he smashed through these books. If you liked the 3-body problem, do you have any reservations in recommending the Dark Forest to someone? Is there something that changed, or some things that fell flat where you would maybe warn someone ahead of time about book 2?
No, I think book 2 is a step up in a lot of ways and has a very impactful ending. I think the pacing is great. I'd say some of the character interactions or some of the skill, I don't want to go into spoilers, or maybe fall a little flat and some people might take issue with it. But overall, I think some of the ideas that are presented here are on par, if not a step up from 3-body problem.
Yes, I'm definitely in agreement with you there. I think that in every element, the Dark Forest is a step up. I think the pacing is better. The plot I found more engaging. I think the character work is better. Some slight changes. The 3-body problem, the actual physics puzzle, was so essential to the first book. Whereas in the Dark Forest, I feel like we get a lot of different ideas. So I like that. I felt like there's probably 10 ideas here which you could make a whole movie out of. And Cixin Liu burned through them all in one book, which I found amazing. But if you like having one big overarching idea, they kind of, well, we won't get into spoilers. There's kind of something along those lines in this, but it was not all derived from the 3-body problem the same way the first book was. The one complaint that I hear a lot about the Dark Forest is a certain character and his relationship and motivations and things like that. Did you find that off-putting? Was there a character where you thought, this character should have been done better, if you know the complaint that I'm talking about?
I do know the complaint you're talking about, and I think it's a valid one, but it kind of comes back to what we said earlier, that these are books more so about the ideas and the concepts that are being explored than your individual character stories. So it didn't really affect my enjoyment overall. But I do recognize it as, being a valid complaint, and I understand where some people are coming from.
Yeah, I think I feel somewhat similarly. I understand the complaint. For me, I didn't find it too off-putting because I didn't think that character was necessarily supposed to be likable. I wasn't necessarily rooting for that. It was like, okay, here's a character that clearly has some flaws and some issues, and here's how he goes about dealing with them and developing things in an unhealthy way. But I was still intrigued. I was still intrigued to learn how he balanced kind of that side of his personality along with the science and everything else that was going on in the book. So I understood the complaint, but for me, it didn't negatively affect my reading experience. So Baron, any final thoughts on the Dark Forest, a score for the Dark Forest before we move on to book 3?
Before I give a score, one thing I think is worth mentioning is the ending of this book is phenomenal. Okay, so it definitely sticks the landing no matter how you enjoy anything that's happened previously in the story. But we didn't mention for really book 1 is there's kind of almost a horrific element, a scary element to some of these books. And I think that the ante's really upped in book 2 with that, this kind of existential dread, if you will. So I just want to point that out. That was a small element to these stories that I just found fascinating that I did not expect from science fiction.
Yes. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's horror in terms of the stereotypical jump scares, horrific, gross, grotesque, violent kind of horror. It's more, as you described it, that existential horror. There is 1 or 2 quotes in book 1 and book 2 where I just kind of I stopped for a second. I just froze. I was just like, "Oh, that is heavy. That is a mind bender. Am I going to be able to sleep tonight? Probably not." So for me, Dark Forest, one of the best books I've ever read. I was absolutely hooked by the story, absolutely hooked by the concepts. It takes some pretty big swings. There's some things in here that I think it set up and delivered really well on, and then some things which took a complete left turn that I was not expecting at all. So very brave writing from Cixin Liu. Pretty close to perfect, other than maybe just losing momentum fractionally at stages, but I'm reaching for to give some cons to this book. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I rated this one 5 stars. It's an incredible book. It really made me fall in love with the series, and I agree with you. I don't know if to say it's one of the best books I've ever read, but for science fiction, it's probably right there at the top.
Awesome. So, we're both fans of books 1 and 2. Let's see if it sticks the landing with The Death's End. And we are back to Ken Liu as the translator. So this should kind of help us decide whether we think that the stylistic changes were due to the translation or just Cixin Liu's writing itself. Did you think there was now a shift back to the first? Was it similar to the second, or did you think the book 3 was kind of its own thing in terms of style?
I felt it was a shift back to the writing from book 1. It was a noticeable prose change for me.
Interesting. I kind of felt like it was halfway between the two, which is, I know, me sitting on the fence and I'm not making a decision. I think maybe stylistically the narrative, I think, got further and further away from book 1, but the writing style maybe did go back to book 1 a little bit. So yeah, maybe I like Joel Mattinson's translation the most, but I don't think either way for me it was like game changing or breaking. If you like, did you think one was drastically better than the other?
No, I don't think it really worth delving into too much. I think they're somewhat similar, and it's really hard to discern what is Liu's writing versus the translations, etc., like you mentioned before. But I did notice a difference between the three.
Nice. So when it comes to book 3, Death's End, I felt like this book kind of got more abstract, more out there. I said that I really like the story and pacing of book 2. Book 3 takes those mind-bending concepts from the first 2 books and ramps it up to 11. Half the time I was reading this book, I was checking my ears for blood, because I'm pretty sure my brain was bleeding trying to make sense of Death's End. What was your experience trying to make sense of the concepts in the final book?
Yeah, I mean, the scope just expands so much. I mean, we already see that in the end of book 2, and it doesn't really seem like it's possible to go too far beyond that, and yet he does that. So I mentioned abstraction before. That is heavily in here. I think having some fundamental knowledge and even armchair physics is going to be somewhat important to this book overall. But yeah, I was just masterfully. I'm just blown away by what he was able to do with Death's End.
Yes, I have not taken any science since high school, so I am definitely not a professional or even amateur physicist. Perhaps having read a lot of sci-fi helped, because I was, at least, didn't have a deep understanding, but at least familiar with some of the concepts. But I'm not sure it's essential. I think if you're the kind of reader that wants to be able to understand everything in detail, this book might be a bit of a stretch. But if you don't mind there just being some crazy ideas and you're like, I'm not exactly sure how this works, but I can just let it wash over me, I don't think it's so complex that it should put people off. Would you not recommend the book to anyone based on that?
No, I agree with you. I mean, it's not like you have to have like mathematical knowledge in some of these concepts, but just, I mean, even small things, just like multi-dimensional principles and stuff like that, time dilation that we see in science fiction, all that I think is important to a degree. But you might be right. If somebody's read a lot of sci-fi and maybe they're not as exposed to physics, I think they'll still feel at home here and comfortable.
Yes, I would hope so. So this book, to me, I said it stylistically felt a little bit more similar to book 2 than book 1, but it does get a little bit more abstract. Did you, any of the new characters, the new storylines, the new concepts that were introduced in Death's End, were there any that particularly stood out to you as in, oh yes, this is one of my favorite aspects, or no, this real element really didn't work for me in book 3?
Um, no, I think overall it was consistent. There was one element I could maybe talk about later that I wasn't a huge fan of. There were some nested stories that were in this one that I felt maybe went a little long, but the way they were utilizing the overall plot was very, very, it just took me by surprise. I didn't expect where it was going to lead, and there was a lot of mysterious elements, but it's difficult to speak to without spoilers. But overall, I think the book was consistent from start to finish. I think the character work was an improvement over the other books in the series, so much so that I actually found some high stakes emotional connections I had with some of the characters that I didn't experience previously. So very well done overall. Incredible book. I mean, I can gush about this all day.
That's awesome. I like that you connected with the characters in book 3. For me, so as you can see, we can do the width test. We love the the width test here on Words in Time. You can see that each book is longer than the last. So we got roughly 400, 500, 600 pages. And for all of you epic fantasy readers, you're probably laughing at me right now. But 600 pages, that's quite a long book. And I didn't feel like Death's End dragged. There were never large chunks that didn't work for me. But relative to the Dark Forest, I thought there were small pockets where the pacing was a little bit off. I felt like if this didn't need a lot of trimming, but I think if this was 500 instead of 600, it would have retained the same tightness of the Dark Forest for me. What were your thoughts on the pacing?
Yeah, it wasn't as fast paced as the Dark Forest, but I felt the stakes were a lot higher, so I still felt the same level of tension that I might have felt in the Dark Forest.
Interesting. So I think that's probably about as much as we can talk about the Death's End without getting into spoilers, which is tempting because some crazy stuff goes on in this book. But Baron, we might be able to talk spoilers in another format soon.
Yes, absolutely. There's so much to unpack with these books. It's spoiler free is quite difficult, other than saying that they're just masterfully done. You should read these books overall, and why are you waiting?
Yes, so as you can probably tell, we're big fans of this series. For me, I'm going to give Death's End a 9 out of 10. I very slightly preferred the Dark Forest just because I was a little bit more engaged in the story and the pacing was a tiny bit better. But the ideas in this book are so ambitious. The scope is epic. If you like sci-fi, I honestly think this is a must-read series. Unless you just can't, you don't want to hear about any physics at all, unless you're like, no, I'm not interested in any hard sci-fi whatsoever, I think you should give this a try. I think this will appeal to like 80 to 90% of sci-fi readers, and it's not perfect. It has a few small flaws as a series, but what I think it does well, it does masterfully well. This is one of my favorite things I've ever read. Baron, I think we know your score, but what's your score for Death's End?
I put 5 stars on Death's End. It was my favorite book in the series. Just the scope of the ideas just completely swept me away.
Awesome. So there you go. Baron liked book 3 even more than book 2. I like book 2 the most, but I think we're in agreement. This is an awesome series. So any final words, Baron, on the series or for the readers out there?
No, you mentioned sci-fi readers being, probably have a high likelihood of enjoying this, and I agree. I will say for readers of fantasy, this is a big deviation from the genre, more so than something, say, like Sun Eater or Dune. This delves into the hard sci-fi concepts, but I think it's still worth your time exploring. It's just a well-crafted, ambitious story done perfectly well, in my opinion.
Awesome. High praise from Baron there. Yep. Should you read The Remembrance of Earth's Past? I say yes. Baron says yes. We hope you enjoyed the video. Definitely go check out Baron's channel. He has an awesome bunch of videos on a range of different genres, sci-fi, fantasy, and beyond. So check it out. Baron, thanks for coming on the channel.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan, so much. Not just for having me on today, but pushing me to actually pick up the first book after I almost bailed on you completely. So big thanks. Love the series, and I owe you a lot for making me read it.
You're welcome, Baron. Well, we hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.